Hey there, I'm Jessica Lauren Walton, and this is my interview corner. If there's a cool story in the security field or just something that I think is going to be helpful for my fellow professionals, then I want to talk about it. To learn more about the work I do as a writer, you can go ahead and check out my blog at www.jessicawaltonwriter.com. Today's guest is John Macaskill, a mindfulness coach and former Navy SEAL commander. At the risk of sounding a little awkward, I'm just going to put it out there. I have a little crush on the Navy SEALs. I mean, like, who doesn't have a crush on the Navy SEALs? And it's not just because they're like so cool and tough. It's actually because they're really funny. I think you have to have a great sense of humor to get through Hell Week, for starters. And if you haven't seen Hell Week, just go on YouTube and check it out. Like, I had a very fleeting moment of, maybe I could, be badass like the SEALs. And then I watched like the first 5 minutes of Hell Week on YouTube, and I was like, oh, no. All right, back to John. He served in the Navy for over a decade in various leadership positions and deployed to several conflict zones, including Iraq, Afghanistan, and Somalia, among other locations. Once he retired from the service, he made it his life's mission to bring mental wellness to veterans and other security professionals in creative and unexpected ways. So I've said enough. Let's go in there and talk to John, because the only easy day was yesterday. Hey, John, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you, Jessica, for having me. I'm honored.
Yeah, I'm really digging that hat.
Thank you.
As an Orthodox Jewish woman, I wear head coverings as well. I don't think people realize that. They're like, oh, she's always wearing some kind of head covering, as a fashion statement. But no, I'm glad to have someone else with a head covering today as well.
I wish I could say that I was wearing it for a formal reason, but it's just because
Yeah.
I've got a bad hair day.
All right, I can forgive that. Oh my gosh, I do have to tell you something. So funny. First of all, you were my first Navy SEAL that I'm interviewing, and I'm just so excited. I'm a little starstruck, and I'll tell you why. Because when I did basic training in the Israeli military, I thought I was a real badass. I went in feeling like, yeah, I'm really cool. I can handle this. And then like a month in, I think it was the sleep deprivation was just starting to kill me, and I just like felt really stupid and weak and miserable. And I went behind a latrine and I cried a little bit, but then I was thinking like, the only easy day was yesterday.
There you go.
Imagine you're a Navy SEAL. I was thinking about like some David Goggins quote. And, and I was like, you're like David Goggins. And I was like, you know what? It could be worse. You could be doing Hell Week. And then I was just playing in my mind the YouTube videos I had watched of Hell Week. And then I was like, Israeli basic training isn't as bad. So I really appreciate that.
I know some tough folks in the Israeli Defense Force that I've worked with. So there are some BA folks over there. So
okay, cool.
cool.
I'm glad the respect is mutual then.
For sure.
All right. So speaking of those psychological challenges, let's kick off with a story.
Yeah.
Tell me about the hardest psychological challenge you ever faced as a Navy SEAL, and what did you learn from it?
Yeah, I mean, as you alluded to, there's Hell Week, there's the Navy SEAL training, there's a lot there that I could unpack, but I would definitely be remiss if I didn't say that my hardest psychological challenge that I faced in the Navy SEAL teams was actually survivor's guilt, and specifically, I felt that after sitting in the operations center, kind of managing the radios and the computers and everything else during Operation Red Wings, which if you or your listeners are not necessarily familiar with that particular operation, that's the operation that's covered in Marcus Luttrell's book, Lone Survivor, and the subsequent movie. And the operation was supposed to be a fairly benign surveillance and reconnaissance mission that was followed with an assault mission. But the surveillance and reconnaissance team was compromised, which that ended up being a big firefight on the battlefield. And I knew, sitting in the operations center, hearing through the radio, through the communications devices that we had guys in a firefight on the battlefield. Finally got a radio call from Michael Murphy, who was the lead on the ground for that operation, and he said that guys were dying, and at this point now I know guys are dying. And then we sent a quick reaction force, quick reaction force, and one of the helicopters was shot down. And on board that helicopter was another 16 guys, eight Navy SEALs, and 8 Army Night Stalkers. So we lost 3 guys on the ground, and then 16 guys in a helicopter. And I was friends with a lot of those guys. I knew their kids, I knew their wives, and I was sitting back in the operations center on the computer and the radio, right? And so I struggled with the survivor guilt from that. And what I learned from that is that I'm here and they're not. And there's nothing that I can do to change that. There's, I went through the different stages of grief, and one of them was denial. And I felt that I needed to replace some of those men. And I was, in my mind, I was like, if only I had done this, if only I had done that. And there was really nothing that I could do to change that. But I have to earn my being alive, because, they don't get the chance to be. They don't get the chance to spend the time with their spouses. They don't get the chance to watch their kids grow up. They don't get many of the opportunities that I do have now. And I have to recognize and honor their sacrifice every day, because their sacrifice did, in a roundabout way, give me the opportunities that I have. And again, I always have to remember and honor that. So I think that was the biggest psychological challenge that I faced. And it's actually tied directly into what I do now, and that's teaching mindfulness and meditation. So I'm trying to honor them in everything that I do every day, and paying it forward in helping others to live a happier, healthier, more fulfilled life through mindfulness and meditation.
Yeah, so that difficult experience that you've gone through, and also the transformation, right, into doing something positive, I think there are a lot of applications for moral injury, right? You could even say that what you were suffering was from moral injury. And there was a recent article in Military Times that the Veteran Affairs Office is going to be doing the first comprehensive nationwide study or survey of moral injury among veterans. And, it's different from PTSD. It's different from having a physical injury. And so, one of the ways to treat that is to do what you're talking about now, to go through that transformation, to make meaning out of your life. And of course, to always remember the people that you fought alongside with.
Right. Yeah. And, incidentally, I run a podcast now called Men Talking Mindfulness. And we're having a guest on this Wednesday to speak specifically about moral injury. And she's a psychologist, worked in the VA for a while, has written a book called Warrior, Dr. Shauna Springer. She's a moral injury expert.
I know.
And
yes.
We're very excited to have her on the show. We've had her on before to discuss men and treatment, and how men, there's a stigma, and I know we're going to talk about that later. There's a stigma around mental health for men. But this week in particular, we're going to be talking about moral injury. So incidental.
Oh, I'm so jealous that you're going to be interviewing Shauna. I have not interviewed her, but I have definitely heard of her because I interviewed Police Sergeant Michael Sugru, who co-authored a book with her, Relentless Courage. And I love the way they constructed the book, where you see, from the perspective of the police officer on the ground, and then you have her analyzing, each situation and what Michael was going through. And she's phenomenal, and she's really dedicated herself to the security community. So that's great that you're going to be interviewing her about moral injury, which is definitely a hot topic right now. So this is a good Yeah.
in these.
Yeah. And it's a very nuanced area,
It
right?
is. Yeah.
So, okay, so you mentioned the podcast. Why don't we just jump to that?
Sure.
Yeah, so you and your co-host Will Schneider run a podcast called Men Talking Mindfulness. You talk about topics like vulnerability, resilience, compassion, and leadership. Are there specific psychological issues that tend to hit men harder than women in the security field?
Um, I don't know that I can say one way or another definitively whether they hit men harder than women. I would say that we deal with it differently.
Mhm.
We grapple with the societal expectations of masculinity, which can often equate to or rather equate emotional vulnerability with weakness, right? Like
Mhm.
um, for a man to show vulnerability, a lot of the time we perceive that as weakness, which we all know that it's not, but it's perceived that way. And that perspective um, can hinder the open discussions about mental health challenges. So like post-traumatic stress, and I don't like to call it post-traumatic stress disorder because I feel that anybody who has been exposed to traumatic stress is going to have some type of effects on them. But issues like post-traumatic stress, anxiety, depression, I think they manifest differently in men, and often the secondary effect of that is anger. We may get depressed and then we get sad at ourselves for being depressed, and then we get mad at ourselves, and then we get mad at everyone around us. And I think it could also manifest as isolation. I know I posted something recently about men being lonely, and we've had guests on to talk about one of the most dangerous things that men face is loneliness, because it's it's difficult to make friends as an adult man without being perceived as kind of a weirdo. Like going out and meeting a new man is kind of odd, and then staying close enough friends to touch base when you're in need, that's rare. So over and above that, I think men resist seeking help for fear of appearing weak or incapable or incompetent. And through our podcast, that's one of the things, or one of several things that we try to do, is break down these barriers and also change the perception of vulnerability, and show that vulnerability, as Brene Brown has spoken about and written about, vulnerability is a strength, and resilience is built not from avoiding stuff, which I did for years. I avoided a lot of that survivor's guilt for years, but it's actually built from confronting that stuff and then processing these emotions. And that's what we are really trying to normalize within the masculine community, is that masculinity and femininity, neither one of them are necessarily strong or weak. There's strengths on both sides, and we all, men and women alike, have masculinity and femininity in us. And the vulnerability is not necessarily exclusive to either one of those sides, and we can tap into it as a masculine energy and really change the way that we feel and live, so that we can live that happier, healthier, more fulfilled life that I always speak about.
Well, what you're talking about is not just applicable to men in the security field, but the wider male population, at least in the United States.
Sure.
I believe I hope these are updated numbers. The suicide rate in the US, it's about between 70 and 80% men who are committing suicide. And
Right.
most of those suicides don't have to do with mental illness. It
Right.
has to do, with life circumstances that could range from, divorce or losing a job. But I think the isolation thing is what is driving. That's my guess without, knowing all, the
Sure.
more granular numbers there. But that is a good point that, women, even when they're older, they're married, maybe established somewhere in the suburbs, whatever, it's not unusual for women to create new friendships, to say,
Right.
let's go get a coffee date. I never thought about it that way. I didn't realize that that is something that is a lot harder for a man to initiate.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I've tried to do it as a man, and I have felt very awkward doing it. Right. I mean, unless we're in a team together, like a basketball team
Yeah,
or, a work team or a church team or something, that's where you're going to make those friends naturally. But it's very rare for a man to make a friend outside of those kind of already established networks. And I've been on the other side where, a man has tried to make friends with me, and I've been like, what's their agenda? What do they want from me? So we're very much guarded, and then we're also afraid of what the perception is if we're trying to make friends. So it can be difficult in that regard. And as far as the suicide rates, I believe that women attempt suicide more than men, but men do it with more. I don't want to use the word success, but that's just the word I have at the tip of my
sure.
tongue.
Yeah.
That they actually follow through, because more often than not, the means that they use are more violent. Quite often, if a woman is going to attempt suicide, she may overdose with some type of medicine and not actually complete the suicide. Whereas a man, especially a lot of men who have access to firearms, that's their go-to.
Yeah.
And there's not a whole lot of survival with that
There is an
method.
impulse issue also that comes to play with suicide. And many people who have survived suicide attempts said they actually, the moment they initiated it, they
Right.
regretted it and wish,
Yeah.
that they could take it back. And it's interesting because this was at least like 2 decades ago. The Israeli military started to notice a rising suicide rate, and they decided not to allow soldiers to bring their weapons home over the weekend, like when they would visit their families, and suicides
Right.
went down by 40%.
Really? Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. Right. And there was something else I wanted to say about the suicides, especially between men and women, but I'm blanking on it right now. So but yeah,
We can
it's
come
a
back
very
to it.
yes, it's a dark topic, but it's important to to look into the dynamics. I know what I was going to say. It's actually not between men and women. It's actually between American and Israelis.
Okay.
Israelis, when they serve, they're usually deployed, right? Maybe a few weeks at a time somewhere. Like it's rare to be deployed, longer than that. Even if there's a war, Israel doesn't usually
Right.
fight extended wars. They can't really afford to,
Right.
right? So people could be in a very brutal situation, and Israeli soldiers absolutely have issues with PTSD, but they're not stationed in Iraq for 15 months at a time. They're coming back to their families and some
Right.
form of normalcy pretty quickly. And the other thing is, Israel's a really small country. It's like maybe an 8-hour drive, top to bottom, east to west, maybe 2 hours. So people can stay in touch much more easily, like Israelis
Right.
staying in touch with friends from all the way back to like preschool. That's not so
Yeah. Good
hard in a
point.
small country. Now, with veterans, they're moving around, right?
Oh
They're being
yeah.
deployed. And then once you're out, sorry, veteran soldiers, but once you become a veteran, that entire team that you had around you, that supportive team that could really understand what you went through, they're not there. They've moved, across the states, and America's a pretty big country. So that is
Yeah.
also,
That's a great
that, but
point.
that the human connection
It's
is what you're
huge.
touching upon that we have to strengthen.
Right. Absolutely. And again, breaking the stigmas around admitting that you're having a challenge, admitting that you don't have all the answers. And we got to go back to the old saying that nobody makes it. No man is an island, right? Nobody makes it through this life alone. So why try to? Why not lean on your friends, your brothers and sisters that are out there, both literal and figurative brothers and sisters, and let them know that, hey, today's not a great day. Maybe this year is not a great year. Maybe whatever. Just lean on one another and start to do it before you're in a crisis. Because a lot of the time when you're in that crisis mode, you're not going to be thinking properly anyway. But if you've already laid the foundation and got that network in place,
Right.
then it's going to be a lot easier to tap into.
Right. You know who to reach out to in a moment of
Right.
crisis.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
So let's talk about the importance of self-awareness for mental health, especially among security professionals. So I recently interviewed several veterans inside my company for a mental health series, and something, a profound underlying theme I noticed, or pattern, was that these veterans who've been deployed for long periods of time were like, they had this lack of connection to their inner selves when they were returning from the combat zone. So with that in mind, one of the first steps in their healing journey was figuring out how to reconnect to the self. And they had, they talked about all different ways and all different therapies they had tried, so there's not one way necessarily for a
Sure.
person. So based on your experience as a mindfulness instructor, can you explain, how do you like train someone in the art of self-awareness? Like, how do you even develop that?
Yeah, I think it's very tough in this day and age when we are constantly bombarded with stuff from the outside to even get in touch with
Mm-hmm.
your inner self. But I remember coming back from these deployments, one of the first things we would do is do what's called a checkup from the neck up. Like, you sit down with a psychologist and they would ask you, this list of prepared questions. Hey, did you see combat? Did you fire your weapon? Did you see any dead bodies? This kind of thing. And you know, they're doing their checks, and I appreciate their effort there. But when you come back from deployment, the first thing you want to do is get back to your family, and this interview is in between you and your family. So the last thing you want to do is be like, yeah, I had a whole lot of trouble on this deployment and I need to talk to you for the next few hours. You're like, yep, I'm good. Nope. I
You just
didn't
want to
ever pull
get
the
through
trigger.
it.
Yeah, I just want to get
Yeah.
through it. So you just want to check that box and be done. So I appreciate the effort there, but the situation wasn't ideal for having a true down to earth conversation.
Or maybe the
So
timing wasn't
the
ideal.
timing, yeah, the timing
Yeah.
was definitely not. But flipping that and where I am now, so based on my experience now as a mindfulness teacher, as a mindfulness instructor, training someone in the art of self-awareness, and I like that the way that you term that, begins with grounding and grounding techniques. So meditation, breath work, um, turning off your cell phone, turning off your internet, getting away from the distractions of everyday life. And that allows you to be present in the moment. So again, these simple breathing exercise, they could be box breathing, many different forms of breath work that are out there. And that those can be profoundly effective as they bring the focus back to the body and kind of turn off the external distractions that are out there. And then over time, as one practices mindfulness and meditation, breath work, they become more tuned to their inner feelings, because when you sit in peace and quiet for a moment, things that you haven't thought about, things that you haven't felt, these feelings, these thoughts, these sensations, they can bubble up to the surface. And that's what happened with me. That's why mindfulness was so profound for me. It was like I filled the silence with noise. I filled it with work. I filled it with, volunteering out in town with my church. I filled it with everything so that I didn't have time to be still and aware of my inner self. And when I sat in peace and quiet and did that introspective work, all this stuff that I boxed up and was like, hey, I'll deal with that later. I'll deal with it later. I never did deal with it. It finally now bubbled up. And I was like, okay, now I have to sit down with someone and talk through this. And that increased awareness can lead to a better understanding of one's reactions to the stressors that are out there. A lot of the time when we get angry or upset, that again is a secondary or even tertiary reaction to something that's inside you. Maybe you're anxious about the society that you're living in, the culture that you're living in, because of you're being exposed to another culture overseas and you're being in combat. And now, I don't know, you go out to eat and you are hyper vigilant and you're facing the door. You don't want anybody like behind you, and you got all this stuff going on, and then it gets too loud and then you get angry and you don't even know why. Well, when you sit down and you do some of this work, it can lead to that, again, that better understanding of the reactions, to the stressors,
Hmm.
and then ultimately give you the tools to manage and better process these reactions in healthier ways.
Yeah, again, I feel like you're talking about stuff that has wider applications for our society. I mean, people are overwhelmed by information today.
For
It's
sure.
nonstop. We're glued to our electronics. And I've really benefited from yoga. I do something
Oh
called
yeah.
surrender yoga, where you hold each position like a very deep stretch for at least 5 minutes at a time, which, when you
Oof.
start doing it, it's kind of torture.
Yeah.
You're like, let's go to the next, movement already. But no, it's amazing. It puts you into a deep meditative state. And as a writer, like any writer, sometimes I have writer's block, which just makes me crazy. And I've noticed it's unbelievable. I go to yoga, poof, writer's
Really?
block is gone. So why
Wow.
is that? Because usually a writer is dealing with it could be an article, manuscript, whatever it is, but you've hit some roadblock and you can't untangle it. And like anyone else, I'm glued to my phone, I'm checking the news on my laptop, I'm doing a million
Sure.
things. And then when you just kind of turn off everything else around you, you have this clarity
Yeah.
and you can focus on one thing at a time. And you can also be honest about what's going on inside of you. And not a lot of people do that, in this day and age. And it really is an art form.
Yeah. It's like when you wake up in the middle of the night and you don't have your computer in front of you, you don't have your TV, you don't have your phone, you're just laying there in bed and it's dead quiet.
Yeah.
Because it's dead quiet now, all these things bubble up in your mind. You're like, oh, I could solve that problem, I could solve this problem. I've solved the world's problems many times in my bed just while sleeping. Because
Do you have a glow in the dark notepad on the
I
side that you just
man
like?
I've tried all the different things. Like, more often than not, I will sit there and be like, oh, that is a great idea. I need to think about that idea for at least 10 minutes so that I will remember it tomorrow. And I've tried the glow in the dark notepad. Literally, I did have one. And
Does
then
that actually exist? I was
it
making that up.
does. It does. Yeah. It was actually created by a kid. And then there was
Brilliant.
yeah, so he could write while he was going on like scout camp or something. And then I had a pen that had a little LED light at the end of it, but it woke my wife. So now I just try to think on everything for about 10 minutes to remember it the next morning. But
Oh
normally
no,
it's
I wish you
good.
didn't tell me because now I'm really tempted to go out and get one of those. I'm like, oh man. But that's happened to
Yeah.
me too. I've woken up at like 2 a.m. and I'm like, oh, I have an idea. I missed, something in a chapter I was writing last week. Okay, and I'll like get up and go to my computer, which is not great for sleep. So I don't
Yeah,
I don't
no, it's
recommend
not
it.
at all. Not at all.
But yeah, that look, I think, we have to be very flexible as people. There are times to turn off your emotions. For example, when you're in the middle of a combat situation or you're a police officer trying to control, a situation on the street, there are times where you really do have to be very analytical, turn off your emotions, but you have to know how to turn them back on.
Yeah.
And there are times when you have to be very involved with a lot of stimulants around you, stimuli. But then there has to be times where you can tune all of that out and be in a quiet place. And I just, teaching people how to do those transitions and that flexibility is really key for mental
Yeah.
health.
Oh, absolutely it is. And that's one, you talked about the the Israeli deployments that are just a few weeks long. Um, there are times when I actually think that having a longer deployment is nicer. The
Hmm.
reason being is, like, I deployed normally typically for six months at a time. I did some shorter 3 month deployments. I did a 9 month deployment, and I did a year long deployment. But what I found is that when you're deployed for that time, it's like a light switch, and you turn it on and you leave it on, and it's on. Whereas in the situation you described, the switch is on and then it's off, and then it's on and then it's off. It's like first responders,
Hmm.
healthcare workers, law enforcement officers. I don't know how, if you have any listeners in those communities,
Yes.
I don't know how they do that. I work with law enforcement officers quite often, and for them to turn their switch on and off and on and off multiple times a day, and then go home and have to turn it off, that is, you take a piece of metal and you bend it over and over and over and over and over, that piece of metal is going to break. And I think that's how our psyches are. So I think sometimes turning it on and leaving it on and then turning it off after 6 months, 9 months, sometimes can be better. Now, obviously, that there's going to be people who disagree with that, but I think there's something to be said for those longer deployments.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting perspective. Yeah, I didn't think about the challenge of doing that at a more rapid cycle, right? In the first
Yeah,
responder, law
yeah, it's
enforcement
tough.
community.
It wears them
Yeah.
out.
Yeah, it's hard because, you could be doing something very intense, very violent, but then you come home and you have to be a gentle father figure or
Yeah,
husband. And that's
yeah,
a tough transition to be doing on a 24, 48-hour
yeah,
cycle.
exactly.
So, as George Orwell pointed out, people sleep peacefully in their beds at night. Yeah, you like that quote. Okay,
I do. I love it.
People sleep peacefully in their beds at night only because rough men stand ready to do violence on their behalf. The ideal warrior, however, is someone who can transition from an environment of violence to a place of compassion, like when returning home.
Mm-hmm.
So this can understandably be a difficult transition for some, as we were just discussing. So what is your advice for transitioning between these two very different mindsets?
Yeah, it's funny. Again, I posted on something similar to this last week where I forget the exact quote. I'm going to butcher it, so I won't even attempt to do it exact, but it said something to the effect of, being a strong and calm and kind person doesn't necessarily make you strong. Or rather, being a kind and nice person doesn't necessarily make you strong. It
Right.
is the people who have seen and done the hard things, who are kind and gentle and nice anyway. Those are the warriors. Those are the true warriors. Those are the ones who can control the violent side,
Mm-hmm.
control their dangerous side. So there's definitely something to be said for the meek who are just meek anyhow, versus those who are meek but can be dangerous if they need to be. Those are the ones I have the more respect for. Anyway, I digress. So
No,
I
that's a
think,
good point. Yeah.
yeah, transitioning from an environment of violence to one of compassion is, again, about understanding the roles that we play and being able to compartmentalize those roles appropriately. And I think there's times when you're going to have to be. I don't like to say violence is the option, and I know a lot of people out there are like, oh well, you were a violent person before, and now you're teaching mindfulness and meditation. Those are completely.
Would you like to PR it a bit? We could call it the elegant use of physical force.
Ooh, wow. Yeah, I like that. Yeah, so what I've somebody told me the other day, they're like, violence is not the answer, but it's an option. I was like, yeah, I like the way you phrase that. But I think you still need to be able to
Yeah.
compartmentalize it, and it's essential to recognize that the skills and mindsets that are required in combat or security environments, for the most part, they are specific to that context. Again, we talked about coming home and being the kind father and the loving spouse. If you bring what you had on the battlefield into home, it's not the correct context. So when returning home, one should focus on, I don't want to say should, because I hate that term, but when returning home, one could ideally focus on reintegrating into civilian life by building connections that we talked about earlier,
Right.
seeking out those supportive communities, engaging in the therapeutic activities that we've spoken about, and that allows for the emotional expression and processing. So you can go from that violent warrior that in that context it's needed, to being a compassionate spouse, compassionate father, compassionate mother. And I think it's also crucial, and Will and I talk about this all the time, Will being my co-host on the Men Talking Mindfulness podcast, self-compassion, having that self-compassion, it's crucial to have that in order to have compassion for others. You can't have compassion for others if you don't have compassion for yourself,
Ooh,
or at least
that's
not
a good one.
true compassion for others.
That's right
Um,
out of Eric Fromm right there. Yeah,
yeah,
the
yeah,
psychologist. Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
There you go. So, and Will just went through this long compassion course, learning all about the importance of self-compassion.
Hmm.
And if you're able to give yourself grace, that's another thing, is a lot of these warriors come home, and because they bring some of this violence or this violent mentality into a context where it doesn't necessarily belong, then they start to beat themselves up. They're like, oh, I am messed up. It's natural to have some bleed over between the two
Hmm.
worlds. And so you have to give yourself grace, and then if needed, which quite often it is, seek that professional help. And don't be afraid of seeking that professional help. If you're seeking that professional help, that's good for you, and it's ultimately going to make you a stronger and better spouse, parent, and warrior. So I think the two, they're not clean and completely mutually exclusive, but there's ways that we can manage to somewhat compartmentalize the contexts if we're able.
Yeah, well, for yourself, when you were transitioning from one environment to another, did you have, I wouldn't call it a routine, but maybe something, trying to find that word, some kind of habit, something that you could do to kind of say, hey, I'm transitioning now, whether that was, I assume, wasn't doing yoga in the
Yeah,
beginning, but just some kind of ritual, that was the term,
yeah,
some kind of ritual that kind of helps you transition through those two environments or
yeah.
mindsets.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, at the micro scale, again, sorry, I'm going to keep referencing things that I've seen and posted on social media recently.
It's
Somebody
okay.
posted something and it had a picture of a man sitting in a car, and it said, why do men sit in their car when they get home from work? And I remember specifically doing this, and I still do it to this day.
Mm.
But when I would come home at the end of every day after doing, violent training, granted it was training, I would drive home, pull into my driveway, and sit there for a few minutes. And I didn't even realize I was essentially doing mindfulness, but I was
Mm.
basically putting a barrier, a veil of some sort, in between the violent warrior John and the home, right? Or I was trying to. Obviously, often I failed, but I would try to take a few breaths behind the steering wheel, radio off, car off, just sitting there in the driveway and decompressing. And that's kind of the micro scale, and I still do that to this day, even though I'm not doing violence. I like to leave work at work and be present when I'm at home with my wife and kids. But then on the macro scale, coming back from a deployment where you have been doing true violence, this is one thing where that neck up, or a checkup from the neck up,
Yeah.
came into play. Was we did third location decompression, is what it was called, TLD. So if we lived in like Virginia Beach and we went to war in Iraq or Afghanistan, we would come back to the US, and before we ever went home, we would go to like Ocean City, Maryland, and we'd spend 2 or 3 days there speaking to the psychologist, doing some physical tests, doing this and that. And then we would just get together and hang out at a bar, just shoot the bull with one another. And I think that was truly a decompression stop, to use kind of a diving term. It was a
Mm.
decompression stop to separate the two, between the combat and what we did at home. I mean, you think about back in World War II, or the previous wars. Very rarely were they on the battlefield, and then the very next day were they home, right? They would get aboard a ship and they would sail back from combat, and they would spend time on that ship, kind of shooting the bull with one another, decompressing, and then finally get back to the States. Granted, I know they saw a lot and they've experienced a lot, and they struggled their own struggles, but they had time to decompress. Whereas now you can be on the battlefield literally that next day, be on a plane and be home that same next day, and not have any time to decompress. So having a decompression, whether it's at the micro scale, like in your driveway, right, taking a few breaths, or at the macro scale, having a couple of days in between the violence and the peacetime, I think those are necessary.
I think it's important to point out that you mentioned kind of two modes, right, of decompression. One you do with others. That could be in a bar,
Right.
with your bros, like, or
Yep.
your tribe, the
Yep.
people
The
who
tribe
understand you.
for sure.
Yeah. And then the other mode of decompression is by yourself. And I think people also have to know, sometimes intuitively, sometimes somebody has to tell you, like, hey, now is a good time to do something with someone else, meaning a therapist or group
Right.
therapy or socializing with others. And now is another time to just sit in your car, take a nice, walk in nature,
Yep.
or do yoga, turn things down a bit. So I just, again, having that flexibility, trying different things and not just sticking to one mode of healing or
Right.
transitioning.
And
Yeah.
if great point. Thank you for mentioning that. And I will also kind of build on that, Jessica, in that if one modality of healing works for your buddy Joe right next to you, and then you try it, you're like, hey, this isn't working, try something else. There are going to be there are various modalities of healing that are out there, and I don't think any single one is a panacea that's going to fix everything.
Right.
So I teach mindfulness and meditation, and that helps me, and it helps a lot of other people. But maybe it won't work for you. Maybe it's not your thing. But maybe yoga is, or maybe qigong, or maybe jiu-jitsu, or I don't know. But there is a healing modality out there for you, and you just have to find what it is that works.
Right. Right. And when I interviewed Dr. Michael Gervais a few months ago, he was
Yeah.
talking about the transitions for athletes,
Right.
coming back from like an intense game and, going maybe to the car with their family and being a little overwhelmed by that. So we were just pointing out there are also like people who are extroverts and people who are introverts.
Oh
So
yeah.
if you're an introvert, going to a bar afterwards with your comrades might be a little overwhelming, right? To
Right.
decompress. It might be a little, better for you to do something on your own first.
Right.
But regardless if you're an introvert, if you're extrovert, I think the point that you keep making is the importance of human connection and
Oh, for
not
sure.
just those superficial connections, but the deeper connections where you feel comfortable enough to lean on somebody and for somebody to lean on you. I think that's also
Right.
very healing, is when somebody feels comfortable enough to lean on you,
Yeah.
and it's mutual.
That's
Yeah.
huge. And I would be lying if I didn't if I said that all that I do as far as teaching mindfulness and meditation was only for those that I teach. There's
Hmm.
a great part of that is cathartic for me,
Right.
right? And I could
Right.
to know that I am giving back, and that other people are healing because of something that I am doing. That's hugely healing for me as well. So maybe find a way, an outlet that you can give back. That could be your modality in and of itself.
Right. No, that totally makes sense.
Yeah.
So, just finishing up,
Yeah.
despite progress in recent years, the stigma around mental health still persists in the security community. What are your recommendations for tackling this stigma?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I know when I was in the SEAL teams, I had a top secret SCI clearance, right? And I
Hmm.
think that's one of the biggest ones, is that within the security community, men and women both, if they have some type of clearance, they feel that if they have a mental health challenge, that they're going
Yeah.
to lose their clearance, and then they're going to lose their job. So I think that one, we need to make it better understood that mental health challenges are part of the human experience, and that they can be addressed, and that they're not insurmountable. Talking about not insurmountable, just the stigma itself, I don't believe I don't believe it is insurmountable. I think we can get past that. So again, I mentioned the security clearance, and there's other facets to this. I think the security organizations need to prioritize mental health and ensure that there are resources available um, for their people to use, and not only that they're there and available and encouraged to use, but the leadership needs to be seen taking advantage of it. Like we had psychologists in the SEAL teams, and initially I was like, oh man, I'm not going to go see that shrink. I'm not going to go see that. And then eventually, I started seeing them. I started to see the value. And then I had this big calendar that sat behind me at my work. And whenever I had a mental health appointment, I would highlight it, I would circle it in red, and I would write mental health appointment. And it was this big calendar that everyone could see. And I had some of my bros come up to me and they're like, hey, John, is everything okay? I was like, yeah, man, why? And they're like, well, I see you have a mental health appointment on your calendar right there. I was like, oh yeah, man, I'm going to go see the doc. I've got a couple things I want to work through, and then I want to maintain my mental health. So one, I think there's, when you say mental health, mental illness, mental challenge, everyone's like, oh, that's mental sickness. Well, mental fitness, maybe we change the term. I could call it
brain
mental
health.
Fitness, like
people are calling it brain health now,
yeah,
and I'm
health.
like, okay, that's interesting.
Yeah, because if we change the term, like we talk about physical fitness, right? And people are all about physical fitness. Hey, congratulations, you went to the gym. Good job, man. Good job, bro. You're keeping your physical fitness up. But if you set a mental health appointment, then they're like, oh man, he's going down the dumps. He needs help, and he's weak. But if we can change that, open up some dialogues around mental health, mental fitness with veterans, the security professionals who can share their success stories of seeking out mental health support, peer support groups, that can also be instrumental in providing a safe space for these discussions. And then I think finally consistent training and education about the signs and the symptoms and the available treatments that are out there. If we can have that start to normalize these conversations, that's going to really ensure the need is met and that the people receive the help that they deserve and need.
Yeah, I like that term, mental fitness. I was laughing about brain health because I interviewed a police officer, not Michael Suger, somebody out in Texas, who said they literally never use the word mental health. They only use the word brain health, because if they say the word mental anything, the police officers are like, we're not touching that. We don't want anything to do with that.
Right.
So, but mental fitness is kind of like, I like that term because fitness is very much an integrated part of your training and continuing training. And if you say, hey, this is an integrated part of our training, like everything else, that's normalizing it instead of, and the fact that you were like, you put it out there and when people saw it, you were like not defensive about it at all. I mean, I think that has a domino effect, ideally, right? And then other people say, oh, okay, he's getting like a tune-up, like he's a car. Okay.
Exactly. We just need a tune-up every once in a while, right? I mean, exactly. We maintain our cars, we maintain our mowers, we maintain everything. But when we're maintaining ourselves, people are like, oh, he's got a problem. No, we don't have a problem. We're just taking care of ourselves.
Yeah, like I think it's good that you touched upon the issue of a security clearance, which is a very complicated topic. It's a topic for a whole other episode, right? But it's interesting. So I was discussing with some of my colleagues in the defense industry recently. At least a third of them, I believe, are veterans. And I said, well, hey, the DCSA, the Defense Counterintelligence Security Agency, put out this big announcement saying, hey, it's like only a very tiny % of people are like lose a clearance over a mental health issue. Very tiny %. And what my very cynical colleagues rightly said, I guess I was overly optimistic. They said, well, that doesn't account for all the people who really have a mental health issue and did not come forward. They do not have an accurate count of all the people who did not come forward because they're afraid to come forward, because it's not just like losing your clearance. You're not just losing your clearance. You're potentially losing your job, burning your career to the ground. Losing the respect of your colleagues. So it's more obviously than just a clearance, but they were pointing out, like, we don't know the real numbers. If all the people who really had mental health issues going on, whether that's something you were born with, like an anxiety disorder you're hiding, or it could be, coming back from the battlefield with post-traumatic stress, right? It could be anything. And maybe there are things that people really shouldn't have a clearance or really shouldn't have a weapon, at least temporarily, right? I mean, that's the reality. But at the very least, people are so afraid to come forward that we don't even know the real percentage of people who would lose their clearances if they did come forward.
No, that's a valid point for sure. I just wish that there was a way for our clearance, the people who manage the clearances, to explain what you will lose it for and what you will not lose it for. Or maybe more definitive. I don't know, like, hey, if you have some anxiety, and maybe getting it addressed through mindfulness and meditation, maybe getting it addressed through some type of medication, which, you know, I'm not necessarily a fan of for long term, but maybe you're
Sure.
in a state where you need it, then that could help you to be a better operator and be more present in the field that you're working in, and ultimately progress in your career. But yeah, there's definitely some education that I think is required on that side of things. It's a tough
Right.
spot.
It is tough, but I agree with you that transparency is really important, especially from leadership. So, almost you can know, like almost look it up, like, hey, would this really be an issue or not? Because
Right.
if you're under, and this happens a lot with the police, if you're under the mistaken impression that you can't even ask for help when you're suffering from a little trauma after being
Right.
exposed to a horrific incident, then that just tends to spiral and get worse. And the tragedy is that if you had just got, you know, treatment earlier on, you wouldn't be, you would be able to take, a little time off and come back to your job, as opposed to later on just spiraling and ruining your
Right.
career or even your family life. And so I really commend you for just, speaking out about, mental health, showing
Thank
that
you.
this isn't something that like we have to be embarrassed about, especially among men. And just, adding your little touches of humor to that. I think that's also really important, is to just have a little humor about stuff
Oh,
and
absolutely.
to
Yeah, we
keep
can't
going
take
on.
life too seriously. We can't. We're only here for so long. We got to have some fun while we're here.